If you're enjoying this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories of frontier justice and survival. Now, let's dive into a story that will leave you questioning the true meaning of sacrifice and redemption. The dust settled on Copper Ridge like a shroud over the dead. Martha Wells pressed her trembling hands against the cracked window pane, watching the three riders approach her modest homestead. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the lead horseman, Jake Morrison, the man who owned half the territory and wanted the other half. Behind her, 8-year-old Tommy clutched his younger sister Sarah's hand. The children had learned to read their mother's fear, like seasoned trackers reading animal signs. When Martha's shoulders tensed and her breathing grew shallow, danger was near. Today, that danger wore a black hat and rode a stallion the color of midnight. Morrison dismounted with the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. His boots struck the porch boards with deliberate weight, each step a promise of trouble. Martha opened the door before he could knock, hoping to keep the conversation outside, away from her children's ears. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wells," Morrison said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. His smile revealed teeth stained yellow from tobacco, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a snake sizing up its prey. "I trust you've given some thought to my generous offer regarding your late husband's property." Martha's jaw tightened. "As I told you before, Mr. Morrison, this land isn't for sale. My children and I have nowhere else to go. This was their father's dream, and I intend to honor it." Her voice carried more strength than she felt, but Morrison's laugh cut through her resolve like a blade through silk. "Dreams don't pay debts, widow. And your husband, God rest his soul, left you with quite a few of those." Morrison pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, waving it like a victory flag. "This here's a legal document stating you owe the bank exactly $3,000, money your dear departed borrowed against this property." The words hit Martha like physical blows. David had never mentioned any debt, any loan against their home. She stared at the document, her vision blurring as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a flash flood in a narrow canyon. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million for a widow with 2 young children and no income. "You're lying," she whispered. But even as the words left her lips, she knew Morrison wouldn't have come this far without legitimate paperwork. Her husband had been a good man, but he'd also been proud, too proud to burden his wife with knowledge of their financial struggles. Now that pride had become a noose around her family's neck. Morrison's companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. These weren't men who settled disputes with words. Martha recognized the type from her years on the frontier, predators who disguised themselves as civilized men but revealed their true nature when convenient. "I'm prepared to be reasonable, Mrs. Wells." Morrison folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. "Sign over the deed to me, and I'll forgive the debt. You and your children can even stay on as tenants. I'm not an unreasonable man, despite what folks might say." His tone suggested otherwise, carrying the threat of violence beneath a veneer of civility. "What kind of rent would you expect?" Martha asked, though she already suspected the answer would be beyond her means. She had no skills that could earn $3,000, no family to turn to, no options that didn't involve losing everything David had worked to build for their family. Morrison's smile widened, revealing more of those tobacco-stained teeth. "Why? Nothing monetary, Mrs. Wells. I'm sure we could work out an arrangement that would be mutually beneficial." His eyes traveled over her form with an hunger that made her skin crawl. "A woman of your particular qualities shouldn't have trouble earning her keep." The implication struck Martha like a physical blow. She stepped backward, her hand finding the doorframe for support. This wasn't just about land or money anymore. Morrison was making it clear that her choices were limited to signing over her property and becoming his property in the process, or losing everything and facing destitution with 2 young children. "I need time to think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The children need their home, their stability. Surely you can understand that." But even as she spoke, Martha could see in Morrison's expression that time was a luxury he wouldn't grant her. Men like him didn't succeed by showing mercy or patience. "You have until sunset tomorrow, Mrs. Wells." Morrison mounted his horse with practiced ease, the leather creaking under his weight. "After that, I'll be forced to take less pleasant measures to collect what's owed me." He touched the brim of his hat in a final mockery of respect before spurring his horse toward town. Martha watched until the riders disappeared behind a ridge, then collapsed against the doorframe. Her legs felt weak, her hands shook uncontrollably, and her mind raced through impossible scenarios. She could try to raise the money, but who would lend $3,000 to a widow with no collateral? She could flee with the children, but where would they go with no money and winter approaching? Inside, Tommy and Sarah waited with the patience of children who had learned that asking questions sometimes brought answers they didn't want to hear. Martha forced herself to smile as she rejoined them, but she could see in Tommy's 8-year-old eyes that he understood more than she wished. The boy had inherited his father's intelligence along with his stubborn chin. "Are we going to lose the house, Mama?" Sarah asked, her 5-year-old voice trembling with confusion and fear. She clutched a worn rag doll, pressing it against her chest like a talisman against the adult problems she couldn't fully comprehend, but instinctively feared. Martha knelt beside her children, pulling them into an embrace that felt like it might be one of their last in their own home. "We're going to figure something out," she promised, though she had no idea what that something might be. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, marking time until Morrison's deadline. That evening, as Martha tucked her children into bed, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Fear gripped her throat as she peered through the curtains. But this wasn't Morrison returning early. A single rider sat motionless on a paint horse, silhouetted against the dying light. Something about his stillness suggested he'd been watching the house for some time. The stranger dismounted slowly, favoring his left leg. Even in the dim light, Martha could see the long coat that reached nearly to his boots and the wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his features. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to anticipate trouble from every direction. When he stepped into the light spilling from her windows, Martha gasped audibly. 3 parallel scars ran from his left temple to his jaw, old wounds that had healed white against his weathered skin. His eyes, pale as winter ice, seemed to take in everything at once, noting the broken fence rail, the struggling garden, the general air of a homestead under siege. "Evening, ma'am," the stranger said, his voice carrying a gravelly quality that suggested a hard life and harder choices. "Name's Marcus Kane. I couldn't help but notice you had some visitors earlier, the kind that don't usually bring good news to folks like yourself." His words were carefully chosen, neither threatening nor overly familiar, but carrying an undertone of understanding. Martha remained in the doorway, her hand on the latch. She'd heard stories of drifters who preyed on isolated homesteads, men who offered help only to rob families blind once trust was established. But something in Kane's manner suggested this wasn't a robbery, at least not in any conventional sense. "I don't know what business that might be of yours, stranger," she replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "My children are sleeping, and I'd appreciate it if you'd move along." But even as she spoke, Martha found herself studying Kane's face, looking for signs of the predatory hunger she'd seen in Morrison's eyes. Instead, she found something else entirely, a weariness that seemed bone deep. Kane nodded slowly, as if he'd expected her wariness. "Ma'am, I've been tracking Jake Morrison and his boys for the better part of 2 weeks. Seems they've been making similar offers to other families in the territory. Offers that aren't really offers at all, if you catch my meaning." His hand rested on his gun belt, not threatening but available. The mention of Morrison's name sent a chill through Martha's spine. If this stranger knew about Morrison's methods, perhaps he also knew about alternatives she hadn't considered. Or perhaps he was another predator, drawn by the scent of desperation that seemed to follow widows and orphans like perfume. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Kane?" Martha asked, opening the door slightly wider. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, promising a storm that matched the turmoil in her heart. Behind her, she could hear Tommy stirring in his bed, always a light sleeper when trouble was near. Kane glanced toward the horizon, where Morrison and his men had disappeared hours earlier. "I'm suggesting that men like Morrison don't usually stop at one family when they find a profitable scheme. And I'm suggesting that sometimes folks need help dealing with problems their local law can't or won't handle." His words carried the weight of experience, of similar situations resolved through methods that didn't involve courts or negotiations. Martha's heart began to race as she understood the implication. This wasn't just a chance encounter. Kane had been watching, waiting, perhaps planning some kind of intervention. But what would such help cost? And was she prepared to pay the price? In her experience, nothing in life came without consequences, especially help from mysterious strangers with scars and guns. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Kane, but I'm not sure what help you could provide that wouldn't make my situation worse. Morrison has legal documents, debt papers that seem legitimate. Even if you could deal with Morrison himself, the debt would remain." Martha's practical nature warred with a growing desperation that made Kane's implied offer increasingly attractive. Kane studied her face in the lamplight, those pale eyes seeming to weigh her words against some internal measure she couldn't fathom. "Ma'am, I've seen those documents Morrison's been waving around. Same type he used on the Hendersons 2 weeks back. And the Mulligans before that. Funny thing about paperwork, sometimes it's not as legal as it appears to be." The revelation hit Martha like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. If Morrison had been using fraudulent documents to steal property from other families, then perhaps her debt wasn't real after all. But proving fraud would require resources she didn't possess, legal knowledge beyond her understanding, and time she didn't have. "Even if you're right about the documents, what difference does it make?" Martha asked, her voice cracking with strain. "Morrison has men with guns, and I have 2 children to protect. Even if I could prove he's lying, he'd never let me live to tell anyone about it." The hopelessness in her voice seemed to echo in the night air. Kane stepped closer to the porch, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Ma'am, I've dealt with men like Morrison before. They're bullies who depend on fear and isolation to get what they want. Take away those advantages, and they're just cowards with temporary power. But I won't lie to you about the risks involved in fighting back." Martha felt her resolve wavering as she considered Kane's words. The stranger seemed confident, experienced in violence in a way that Morrison's hired guns might not expect. But involving Kane would mean dragging her children into a dangerous game with stakes she couldn't fully understand. On the other hand, surrendering to Morrison meant sacrificing everything David had worked for and subjecting herself to a fate worse than poverty. "What would you want in return for your help?" Martha asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. In her experience, men didn't risk their lives for strangers without expecting substantial compensation. Kane's scars suggested he was no stranger to violence, which meant his help would come at a price measured in more than money. Kane's expression softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the hardened exterior. "Ma'am, I won't insult your intelligence by claiming I don't want anything, but what I want might surprise you. I want Morrison and his type to stop preying on families like yours. I want children to grow up in their own homes instead of being driven away by legal thieves." The answer wasn't what Martha had expected, but it also wasn't specific enough to ease her concerns. Men often claimed noble motivations while harboring selfish desires. Kane's apparent sincerity could be genuine, or it could be a more sophisticated form of manipulation. than Morrison's crude threats. Either way, Martha found herself facing an impossible choice between certain destruction and uncertain salvation. "I need time to think," she said finally, echoing her earlier response to Morrison. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was asking for time from two different men who held her family's future in their hands. But Kane's reaction was markedly different from Morrison's impatience. He simply nodded and stepped back from the porch. "I'll be camped about a mile west of here, near the old oak grove," Kane said, gathering his horse's reins. "If you decide you want my help, you can find me there. But ma'am, Morrison's deadline is tomorrow at sunset. After that, your options are going to become much more limited." He mounted with practiced ease despite his apparent leg injury. As Kane rode away into the darkness, Martha closed and barred the door, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. She moved through her evening routine mechanically, banking the fire, checking on the children, securing the windows. But her thoughts remained focused on the choice that lay before her, like a fork in a dangerous trail. Tommy appeared in the doorway of the children's room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mama, who was that man?" he asked, his young voice filled with the curiosity that hadn't yet been entirely crushed by their difficult circumstances. The boy had his father's tendency to wake at the first sign of trouble, a trait that worried Martha in their current situation. "Just a traveler, son. Go back to bed." Martha guided Tommy back to his small bed, tucking the covers around him with gentle hands that trembled slightly. She wondered how much longer she could protect her children from the harsh realities of their situation, how much longer she could maintain the pretense that everything would be all right. That night, Martha lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through scenarios that all seemed to end in disaster. If she accepted Morrison's terms, she would be trading her dignity and freedom for the illusion of security. Her children would have a roof over their heads, but at what cost to their understanding of right and wrong? How could she teach them to stand up for themselves when she had surrendered to a predator? On the other hand, accepting Kane's help meant gambling everything on a stranger's promise. She knew nothing about his past, his methods, or his true motivations. The scars on his face testified to a violent history, but violence solved some problems while creating others. If Kane's intervention failed, Morrison's revenge would likely extend beyond simple eviction. Morning brought no clarity, only the relentless passage of time toward Morrison's deadline. Martha went through the motions of preparing breakfast for her children, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Tommy and Sarah sensed the tension, eating in unusual silence, while casting worried glances at their mother's haggard face. After breakfast, Martha sent the children to play in the garden while she stood on the porch, staring toward the oak grove where Kane had made his camp. She could see a thin tendril of smoke rising in the distance, evidence that the scarred stranger was still waiting for her decision. The sight both comforted and terrified her, representing as it did her only alternative to complete surrender. Around midday, a neighbor woman named Helen Crawford rode up on an aging mare. Helen lived with her husband on a small ranch 5 miles to the east, and her unexpected visit sent alarm bells ringing in Martha's mind. Neighbors in this isolated country didn't make social calls without good reason, especially not when trouble was brewing. "Martha, honey, I had to come warn you," Helen said without preamble, dismounting with the stiffness of a woman past her prime. "Word's gotten around about Morrison's deadline. Some of the men in town are saying it's a shame what's happening to you, but none of them are willing to stand up to Morrison's guns. Sheriff Brennan's been bought and paid for, so don't expect any help from that quarter." The confirmation of what Martha already suspected hit her like a physical blow. She had harbored a slim hope that Morrison's actions might provoke community outrage, that decent people would rally to support a widow with young children. Instead, it seemed that fear had paralyzed the town, allowing Morrison to operate with impunity. "There's more," Helen continued, glancing around nervously as if Morrison's men might be watching from the nearby hills. "Morrison's been bragging in the saloon about his plans for you. He's not just interested in your land, Martha. He's got ideas about what kind of arrangements you'll be making to pay your rent. Ideas that would make a decent woman sick to her stomach." Martha felt her knees grow weak as the full implications of her situation crystallized. Morrison wasn't just a land grabber. He was a predator who had found a legal way to acquire both property and victims. The fraudulent debt was merely a tool to force women into situations where they had no choice but to submit to his desires or face destitution with their children. "Helen, did Morrison use the same tactics on other families?" Martha asked, remembering Kane's claims about the Hendersons and Mulligans. If she could gather evidence of a pattern of fraud, perhaps she could find some legal recourse, some way to expose Morrison's scheme without resorting to violence. Helen's expression grew even more troubled. The Hendersons lost their place 2 months ago. Emily Henderson tried to fight Morrison in court, but somehow all the witnesses disappeared or changed their stories. Last I heard, she and her boys were living in a shack outside Tucson, barely scraping by. The Mulligans just packed up and left in the middle of the night rather than face what Morrison had planned. The stories confirmed Kane's information while destroying Martha's hopes for a legal solution. If Morrison controlled the sheriff and could intimidate witnesses, then the courts offered no protection. Her choice had narrowed to complete capitulation or trusting a dangerous stranger whose methods would likely involve bloodshed. After Helen left, Martha stood alone on her porch, watching the sun track across the sky toward the horizon that would mark Morrison's deadline. Her children played in the garden, their laughter a painful reminder of innocence that would soon be lost regardless of her decision. Tommy built castles in the dirt, while Sarah dressed her doll, both blissfully unaware that their world was about to change forever. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Martha made her decision. She gathered her children and explained that they were going to take a walk to visit the nice man who had stopped by the previous evening. Tommy's eyes sharpened with understanding beyond his years, while Sarah simply nodded and collected her doll with the trusting acceptance of childhood. The walk to Kane's camp took 20 minutes across rough terrain that Martha normally would have considered too dangerous for Sarah's short legs. But nothing about their situation was normal anymore, and desperate circumstances called for desperate measures. Kane's smoke trail had disappeared, but Martha pressed on toward the oak grove, hoping she wasn't making a terrible mistake. They found Kane seated on a fallen log, methodically cleaning a rifle that looked well-maintained and frequently used. He glanced up as they approached, his pale eyes taking in the children with an expression Martha couldn't quite read. When he stood to greet them, she noticed again the careful way he favored his left leg, wondering what old injury had left him with that permanent reminder of violence. "Mr. Kane," Martha began, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I've come to discuss your offer, but I need to know exactly what you're proposing and what risks my children will face. I won't put them in danger based on vague promises, no matter how desperate our situation becomes." Her maternal instincts demanded complete honesty before she committed her family to an uncertain course. Kane nodded approvingly, as if her caution pleased him rather than frustrated him. "Ma'am, I appreciate your directness. What I'm proposing is this. I'm going to prove that Morrison's debt papers are fraudulent, and I'm going to make sure he doesn't bother you or any other families in this territory again. The methods I use might not be pretty, but they'll be effective." Martha studied Kane's scarred face, looking for signs of the madness or bloodlust that might drive a man to take such risks for strangers. Instead, she found a steady determination that reminded her of her late husband's commitment to protecting his family. But David had died young, leaving her to face the consequences of his noble intentions alone. "What exactly do you want from me in return?" Martha asked, her arms instinctively moving to encircle her children's shoulders. The question had haunted her since their first meeting, and Kane's evasive answer the night before had only increased her anxiety. Men didn't risk their lives without expecting something in return, and Kane's motivations remained mysterious. Kane looked directly into her eyes, his pale gaze never wavering. "Ma'am, what I want is for you to trust me enough to let me do what needs to be done. I want you to keep your children safe while I handle Morrison. And when it's over, I want you to remember that not all strangers come bearing ill intentions. Some of us are just trying to balance the scales a little bit." The answer was both more and less than Martha had expected. Kane's request for trust seemed genuine, but trust was a luxury she could barely afford. Still, as she looked at her children and thought about Morrison's approaching deadline, she realized that trust might be the only currency she had left to spend. "Mr. Kane," Martha said slowly, "I'm going to make you an offer that I pray I won't regret. I'll trust you to handle Morrison, but if anything happens to my children because of this decision, I'll hold you responsible. They're all I have left in this world, and they're worth more to me than any piece of land or any amount of money." Kane's expression softened as he looked at Tommy and Sarah, both of whom were studying him with the frank curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned to fear scarred strangers. "I understand, Ma'am, and I give you my word that your children will be safe. But I need you to take them somewhere secure while I work. Do you have somewhere you can go for a few days?" Martha's mind raced through her limited options. Helen Crawford might take them in for a short time, but involving neighbors could put them at risk if Morrison decided to seek revenge against anyone who helped her. The abandoned line shack about 10 miles north might provide temporary shelter, but it was isolated and offered little protection if things went wrong. "There's an old line shack up near Bear Creek," Martha said finally. "It's not much, but it's isolated and has a good view of the surrounding country. If we need to run, we'd see trouble coming from a long way off." The admission of her contingency planning seemed to please Kane, who nodded approvingly at her practical approach to danger. "Good. Pack supplies for a week and head up there first thing in the morning. I'll deal with Morrison tomorrow evening when he comes calling." Kane began reassembling his rifle with practiced efficiency, each movement economical and sure. The weapon disappeared back into its saddle scabbard like a dangerous secret temporarily hidden from view. "How will I know when it's safe to come back?" Martha asked, suddenly realizing that Kane's plan could go wrong in any number of ways. If Morrison killed Kane, she would be left with nothing but temporary refuge and nowhere to run when Morrison's patience ran out. The thought of facing that possibility alone with 2 young children was almost paralyzing. "If I don't come for you within 3 days, pack light and keep moving north," Kane replied matter-of-factly. "There are decent folk in Colorado who'll help a widow with children get a fresh start. Don't try to come back here, because Morrison's type don't forget slights, and they don't forgive challenges to their authority." His words carried the weight of experience with similar situations. The casual way Kane discussed the possibility of his own death sent chills through Martha's spine. This wasn't a man playing hero for glory or romance. This was someone who understood exactly how dangerous Morrison could be, and was still willing to face that danger for strangers. The knowledge should have comforted her, but instead it highlighted the desperate nature of their situation. As they walked back toward the homestead, Martha's mind churned with preparations and contingencies. She would need to pack carefully, balancing the children's needs against the limitations of what they could carry: food, blankets, ammunition for David's old rifle, medical supplies, and enough clothes to last a week in potentially harsh conditions. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Martha began her preparations in earnest. She moved quietly through the house, gathering supplies and trying to decide what to take and what to leave behind. Each decision felt like a small betrayal of David's memory, an admission that his dream of building something permanent had failed. She packed David's old rifle and the box of ammunition he'd kept hidden behind the flour barrel. The weapon was well maintained, but hadn't been fired in over a year. Martha had learned to shoot as a young woman, but her skills were rusty, and she prayed she wouldn't need to rely on them. Still, in the wild country around Bear Creek, the rifle might mean the difference between survival and disaster. As she worked, Martha found herself thinking about Cain's scarred face and the steady determination in his pale eyes. What had driven him to take such risks for strangers? Was he motivated by some code of honor, a desire for redemption, or simply the restless nature of a man who had found his calling in dangerous places? The mystery troubled her even as she prepared to trust him with her family's future. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the reality of leaving the only home her children had ever known. Tommy seemed to understand the gravity of their situation better than his sister, helping pack supplies with grim efficiency that reminded Martha painfully of his father. Sarah treated the expedition like an adventure, chattering excitedly about camping in the mountains until Martha's heart nearly broke. They left the homestead just after sunrise, Martha leading David's old mule loaded with supplies while the children walked beside her. She had explained their trip as a precautionary measure, a way to stay safe while adult business was conducted. Tommy's skeptical expression suggested he understood more than she intended, but he kept his questions to himself. The journey to Bear Creek took most of the day, following game trails and cattle paths that David had shown Martha during their early years together. The line shack was exactly as she remembered. A single room built of logs and stone, weathered but solid, with a clear view of the surrounding valleys. Water was available from the creek, and there was enough shelter for several days if necessary. As evening approached, Martha found herself watching the southern horizon where her homestead lay, hidden behind rolling hills. Somewhere down there, Morrison would be approaching with his deadline and his threats, expecting to find a helpless widow ready to surrender everything. Instead, he would find Cain waiting with whatever justice a scarred stranger dispensed to men who preyed on the vulnerable. "Tell me a story, Mama," Sarah requested as they settled down for the night. The little girl had accepted their temporary camping arrangement with the resilience of childhood, but Martha could see anxiety beginning to show around the edges of her daughter's composure. Stories had always been Martha's way of soothing the children when life became too harsh or frightening. Martha pulled both children close, wrapping them in blankets while she searched her memory for a tale that might comfort without adding to their fears. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a brave knight who traveled the land helping people who couldn't help themselves. He had scars from many battles, but his heart was pure, and he never turned away from someone in need." As she spun the improvised tale, Martha found herself wondering if she was describing Cain or simply creating the hero she desperately needed him to be. The distinction seemed less important than the comfort her words brought to Tommy and Sarah, who gradually relaxed into sleep while the story wound toward its inevitable happy ending. That night, Martha lay awake, listening to the sounds of the wilderness and thinking about the confrontation taking place somewhere in the distance. Had Cain found Morrison at the homestead? Were they talking, fighting, or had violence already erupted in the manner of men who settled disputes with guns rather than words? The uncertainty was almost unbearable, made worse by the knowledge that her family's entire future hung in the balance. Morning brought no news, but Martha hadn't expected any. Cain had warned her that resolution might take time, and patience was now her only option. She kept the children occupied with camp chores and exploration, but her attention remained focused on the southern horizon, where their old life waited in uncertain suspension. The second day passed with agonizing slowness. Martha found herself jumping at every sound, expecting either Cain's return or Morrison's arrival with news of Cain's failure. The children sensed her tension, despite her efforts to appear calm, And by evening, Tommy was asking direct questions about when they could go home that Martha couldn't answer honestly. On the third morning, Martha woke to find a familiar figure approaching their camp on foot. Kane walked with the same careful gait she remembered, but something in his bearing suggested that his business with Morrison had been concluded successfully. As he drew closer, Martha could see dried blood on his coat and a fresh bandage around his left arm, evidence that the resolution hadn't come without cost. "It's done," Kane said simply as he accepted the cup of coffee Martha offered with shaking hands. "Morrison won't be bothering you or anyone else in this territory again." His men scattered when they realized their boss was gone, and the sheriff suddenly discovered an urgent need to investigate Morrison's business practices. "Your debt papers have been proven fraudulent and destroyed." Martha felt her knees grow weak with relief, but Kane's matter-of-fact delivery and obvious injuries raised new questions. What exactly had happened at the homestead? Had Kane killed Morrison, or had some other form of justice been dispensed? The blood on Kane's clothes suggested violence, but Martha found she didn't want to know the specific details. "What about you?" she asked, indicating his bandaged arm. "That looks like more than a scratch." Kane's injury reminded her that his intervention had come at personal cost, that he had risked his life for strangers based on principles she still didn't fully understand. The debt of gratitude felt overwhelming, impossible to repay. "I've had worse," Kane replied, with a slight smile that transformed his scarred features. "The important thing is that you and your children can go home and build the life your husband wanted for you. Morrison's schemes died with him, and his hired guns have found employment elsewhere. The threat to your family is over." As they prepared to return to the homestead, Martha realized that Kane's work was finished, and he would soon be moving on to whatever destination called to men like him. The knowledge filled her with unexpected sadness, as if she were losing a friend she had barely begun to know. Kane had become part of her family's story, but his role was ending just as theirs was beginning again. The journey home took on the feeling of a pilgrimage, a return to a place that had been saved from destruction through violence Martha preferred not to contemplate. The children chatted excitedly about sleeping in their own beds again, while Martha wondered what she would find at the homestead and how she would explain Kane's departure to Tommy and Sarah. They found the house exactly as they had left it, but something intangible had changed. The oppressive feeling of impending doom had lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility that Martha hadn't felt since David's death. Morrison's threat was gone, and with it the crushing weight of impossible debt and unthinkable choices. Her children could grow up in their father's house after all. Kane helped them unload supplies and check the homestead for any damage, but Martha could see his restlessness growing as the day progressed. Men like Kane weren't meant for domestic tranquility. They were drawn to places where their particular skills were needed, where injustice called for the kind of resolution that decent society preferred to handle at a distance. As evening approached, Kane prepared to leave with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. He checked his horse's gear, secured his weapons, and gathered the few possessions that defined his nomadic existence. Martha watched these preparations with growing awareness that she might never see him again, that her family's salvation had come through the intervention of a man destined to remain forever outside the peaceful life he had helped restore. "Before you go," Martha said as Kane prepared to mount his horse, "I need to ask you something. What you did for us? The risk you took for strangers? Why? What drives a man to live the way you do, always moving toward the next fight, the next family in trouble?" Her question had been building since their first meeting, and Kane's imminent departure made it urgent. Kane considered her words while settling into his saddle, his pale eyes distant with memories Martha could only imagine. "Ma'am, some men are built for peaceful lives, for building homes and raising families and watching their children grow up safe. Other men are built for the spaces between, for the problems that can't be solved with words or laws or good intentions. I reckon I figured out which type I am a long time ago." The answer was both complete and insufficient, revealing something essential about Cain's nature while leaving the deeper mysteries intact. Martha understood that she was seeing a man who had found his purpose in life's violent margins, who brought justice to places where it was desperately needed but couldn't stay to enjoy the peace his actions created. As Cain rode away into the gathering dusk, Martha gathered her children on the porch to watch his departure. Tommy and Sarah waved goodbye to the scarred stranger who had saved their home, their innocence intact because they had been spared the details of how that salvation had been accomplished. Martha waved too, understanding that she was bidding farewell to a guardian angel who wore his wings in the form of gun leather and bore his halo as 3 parallel scars. Years later, when her children had grown and begun families of their own, Martha would tell them the story of the stranger who had appeared when hope seemed lost. She would describe Cain's courage and sacrifice without dwelling on the violent details, painting him as the hero he had been despite the dark methods his heroism required. The story would become family legend, passed down through generations as an example of how strangers sometimes proved themselves to be angels in disguise. But on that evening, as Cain's figure disappeared into the darkness beyond the hills, Martha simply held her children close and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the mysterious forces that had brought salvation when all seemed lost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build the life David had envisioned, but tonight they were home and safe, protected by the sacrifice of a man whose name would be remembered with reverence long after the circumstances of his intervention had faded into legend. The Old West was full of such stories, tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and finding help from unexpected sources. In the land where law was often distant and justice frequently had to be administered by individuals rather than institutions, men like Cain served as the balance between civilization and chaos, ensuring that the strong didn't always prey upon the weak without consequence. Now I want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you think Martha made the right choice, trusting a dangerous stranger to save her family? What would you have done in her situation, faced with impossible choices and nowhere else to turn?